We are concluding the first section of Moses' life tonight, as we've been looking at the first 40 years of Moses' life. And of course, we've entitled that section as Moses in Pharaoh's palace. And the event, as you consider Exodus, the first chapter, and you may want to turn there as we'll be looking at a couple passages again tonight. The event that really springboards everything in Moses' life is the killing of the babies that takes place in that first chapter. And it's amazing to me, as atrocious as that event is, it is what God uses as a springboard. It's that great event, and so many of our lessons in this first 40 years have sprung off of that horrific event. And I say that to be mindful that no matter what takes place, I appreciate Kevin's song that he sang early tonight, "The battle belongs to the Lord," because we can never be reminded too much of the fact that the battle does belong to the Lord. I appreciate Ernie's prayer for our nation, and we can continue to pray for our nation, but ultimately we know that regardless of what this physical nation does, we belong to a spiritual nation, a spiritual kingdom that far succeeds anything that takes place in this physical life. But we're looking tonight at this final step, and maybe the most difficult aspect of what takes place in the beginning of Moses' life, with the slaying of all these babies. And I don't think that it would be as difficult to address if there weren't such real parallels to our time and our nation today. The title is "When a Nation Throws Away Its Future." We've made this topic about choice. But it's more important than about choice. It's about future. We've made this scenario about politics. But it's more important than politics. It's about life. Unwanted babies and nation's demise. I think we're going to see tonight that the undoing of Egypt is killing babies. I hope we will continue to be inspired to take strong stances, to protect those who are unable to protect themselves, and to engage in conversations that are difficult to engage in, but are necessary. My aim tonight is to reinforce what I believe all of you likely already believe. If that's not the case, my aim tonight is to be persuasive. My aim tonight is to continue to equip you with the ability to be persuasive. There are a lot of different weapons of war. The primary war that we fight is a spiritual war, and we have spiritual weapons. But on the surface, the war that we are fighting is one of opinions. And in this nation, we need to enter into that war of opinions. We need to use the weapons of persuasiveness and logic and do our level best to protect those who are unable to protect themselves. As I mentioned, as we come back to this first chapter, as you're in this first book of Exodus, you would maybe get the idea that things were going well. Because over and over again, we have that word multiplied. In fact, in verse 7 of Exodus, the first chapter, we read, "But the people of Israel were fruitful, I have been fond of in the last year mentioning but God. And essentially that's what we read in this 7th verse here. That things weren't ideal, but God is causing the people of Israel, verse 7, they were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. God is blessing them. Again in verse 12, but the more they were oppressed. You see, Pharaoh looks and he says, this can't continue. They're multiplying too much. If you're successful in life, you're going to be seen as a threat. If you're seen as a threat, you're going to be attacked. The more successful we are as a congregation, the more we'll be attacked. The more successful you are as an individual, the more you'll be attacked. The more successful God's people were in Exodus, the 1st chapter, the more the king felt it necessary to oppress them with the purpose of crippling them. But again, continuing with verse 12, again, but God, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. He couldn't cripple them. In verse 20, now Pharaoh had said, we're going to kill the babies. We're going to kill the male babies. But look what continues to happen after faithful obedience of the midwives. In verse 20, so God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. One of the points that I've tried to emphasize throughout the life of Moses, throughout our series of lessons, is this idea that the circumstances don't control us. Our circumstances don't dictate what happens to God's people. Now, that impacts us. It affects us. But God is in control, and even amidst this great threat, we have God blessing His people, and they continue to multiply. The reason for this was told in Genesis, the 46th chapter, and verse 3, where God told the people that they would go into Egypt and that He would bless them and that they would multiply. In essence, in Deuteronomy 26 and verse 5, He tells them that the few went in. This is Moses giving the law right before they enter the promised land, and he's reminding them that when they give their sacrifices, they are to be mindful of the fact that when they went into Egypt, they did so as few, but that they came out many. In essence, this verse doesn't openly state it, but what Moses is getting at, you went in as a small family and came out a mighty nation. God had blessed the people. As we come back to the 1st chapter of Exodus, we ended there with verse 20. You'll recall that Pharaoh, the king, had told the midwives, when you come about a Jewish woman on the birthing stool and she's delivering a male child, kill that child. Midwives refused to do it. And they continue to thrive. Now, Pharaoh comes to the midwives and he says, what's going on? Someone pointed out to me recently, the midwives essentially lied here. He says, well, these Hebrew women, they're hardy. They're giving birth before you Egyptian women would ever think about getting the job done. They don't need help. And yet God blesses them. I think we dealt with this a little bit in our Bible study this morning. And I think it's precious to be reminded that God's about people. God blesses these midwives because they understand the sanctity of life. And they take a stance for life and they save God's people through their action. But old Pharaoh, he's not deterred, is he? More of the same, they would say. And notice in verse 22 what Pharaoh says. And Pharaoh commanded all of his people, every son that is born to the Hebrews, you shall cast them into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Notice who Pharaoh's relying on. He says to all of his people, we're going to kill these babies. That seems like a lot, doesn't it? Pharaoh has a lot of allies. Or does he? God was on the Israelite side. God was on the side of life. And while Pharaoh may have had all of his people, his allies were incredibly limited. If you would, turn your Bibles to Psalm, the 127th Psalm. Because Pharaoh, and we will address this a couple of times throughout our lesson, looked at these babies and he saw a threat. Pharaoh looked at these babies and he saw an inconvenience. Pharaoh looked at these babies and saw something less than human. Or probably more accurately, saw humans as much less than God saw them. But you see, according to Psalm 127, we could look at so many passages along these lines. God looks at them different. Children, I'm about to read what God thinks of you. Psalm 127 in verse 3 says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward." You see, God looked at them a little bit differently. One of the emphases throughout this entire first section that we looked at was that children are a blessing. Children are not an inconvenience. Now, don't get me wrong. As much as I love our children, I was shocked when we first started having children that they don't come with an off switch. You see, my phone, even as attached as we've become to our phones, if I don't want to hear it anymore, I can mute the thing. I can leave it in this very cold evening in my truck if I so choose. Can't do that with my children. And so sometimes they wane on me. Sometimes they wear you down. But children, I want you to know, you're precious. You're dear. And God has said that you are a heritage, a great reward. You see, that's how God looks at life. Why is that the case? Genesis, the first chapter, makes a statement as Christians. Maybe we read it so much that it becomes mundane. Maybe we are so familiar with the idea that we don't realize how precious it is. Maybe we hear it so much that we quit realizing its uniqueness. But Genesis, the first chapter, in 26 and 27, says that when God made Adam and Eve, that he made them in his image, in his very own image. And that's incredibly important because that's unique. Did you know that the Egyptians looked at Pharaoh and believed that Pharaoh bore the likeness of God? But his court did not. The canal digger did not. The brick maker did not. The seller in the market did not. You see, there was one individual who bore the likeness of God. Isn't it interesting that archaeology, to the very best of my knowledge and to my findings and to others who are much more scholarly than myself, archaeology has never found any society that has made a claim like this, that all human beings are made in the image of God. It's earth-shattering. Is regrettable, is wrong. As slavery was in this country. It was this diluted version making it into our Constitution that gave us a path forward. It's not found elsewhere in the world. It's stated by the Creator of the world that man is made in the very image of God. Not just the king, but everyone is made in the likeness of God. By Genesis, the 5th chapter, again, that's Genesis 1, but by Genesis, the 5th chapter, in the first verse, we see that given the genealogy of Adam, that Scripture restates this, as he says about the genealogy of Adam, who was made in the likeness of God. It's reemphasized. You know what's interesting about that? Thousands of years later, James writes in James, the 3rd chapter, in verse 9, that we ought to be mindful of the fact and aware of the fact that man is made in the likeness of God. You see, it was true at the beginning of creation. It was true when James wrote it several thousand years later. And it's true several thousand years after that, that God cares for his people. Pharaoh saw a threat. King Herod at the time of Christ looked and saw a threat. But it's important that we emphasize that children, that babies, born and unborn, are more than rocks and plants. Their value is not equal. They are greater. They are not animals. Their value is greater. A few months ago, we looked at Genesis, the first few verses, the 2nd chapter, actually, I believe is where we see this, that we read of mankind. Not only was he made in the image of God, but that God breathed life into mankind. It's interesting that we don't read that about plants, although they are alive. We don't read that about animals, although they are alive. I believe that God endowed within man something much greater. The soul, the conscience, the spirit. Something of himself that is unlike anything else in this world. That is meant to be eternal and will be eternal. You see, babies are superior to animals. And children, you are much more important and precious than a simple combination of chemicals. I thought about asking a question here to solve a debate we had down Hawk Hall about how many of you know what the periodic table is, but please don't raise your hand. I don't want to know. But that's what that is. That's the periodic table, right? And this is all the elements. And everything that we know consists of these elements and some combination of them. You can find water up there, right? But with a combination of hydrogen and 2 oxygen. Or vice versa, yeah. Excuse me. See, I'm not a chemistry major. 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, right? You can find everything's up there. And if we're to break down our physical bodies, we will find a combination, although a complex combination, of chemicals from there. You know, it's interesting, folks. We read about stuff, about sodas and teas and things That's made up of 42 different chemicals. Well, so is everything. That water's made up of 2 chemicals, right? Everything's made up of chemicals. Just because it's chemical doesn't mean it's bad. We are chemicals. I'm not disputing that. But we are something greater than chemicals. If we were not, we could make ourselves. I can make water. I can't. I already demonstrated. I'm not a chemist or a chemistry major or anything close to that. But you can take oxygen and hydrogen and combine them and make water. You can make all kinds of different things. We can make diamonds in a lab that's far superior to what we find in nature. And while you consist of chemicals, you are something much greater and more complex than a combination of chemicals. You are gods, belonging to gods. I say that periodically. I don't want you to think that I think you are a god. I mean that you belong to God. You're God's creation. He breathed into you life. You see, we were created in the image of God. Pharaoh killed babies in an effort to control population. Herod killed babies in an effort to kill the King of Kings. But as repulsive, folks, as that is, it doesn't compare with how repulsive what goes on in our very country is. I am proud to be an American, but this issue makes me hesitant to say that. I don't think we understand how significant abortion is. What I have up here is the total number of casualties from every war. Not every war, but these selected wars. 50,000 people died to give us our independence. 50,000. An additional over 1 million died in the uncivil war. An additional one, we'll call it 0.4 million, died in the world wars combined. And another 211,454 precious souls died in Vietnam. American casualties. No number is significant without a number to compare it to. And I give you these numbers because we understand how atrocious war is. But those numbers aren't a drop in the bucket compared to the 45 million babies, most of which are needlessly slaughtered between the years of 73 and 05. 45 million. We can't be silent. We cannot be silent. And let me say, because I've got 3 politicians up here of sorts, 3 influencers certainly. Don't let your politicians make this a political issue. This isn't a political issue. This is a right and wrong issue. I make a point of not being argumentative with my clients, but I had a client one time explain to me that she can't understand how someone is so dumb to be a one-issue voter. And folks, I understand why people have opinions, and I respect varying opinions. My grandparents, to the best of my knowledge, never voted, and I don't think most of your generation in the church, Dean, Eddie, voted. I understand where you're coming from that. In fact, that started with Hardman is building up to the Civil Wars. He watched politics splitting the church apart. And I have mentioned from this very pulpit that I see the same thing happening today. I've seen congregations split recently over politics. We've got to avoid it. What we're doing is way more important than politics. But in this country, we have been giving a tremendous gift. A gift paid for on the backs of the lives that we had above us, starting with the 50,000 in the Revolutionary War, and those that died in the years after, to give us a vote. In the last election, and I try not to talk about my politics, I voted for Republicans, I voted for a Democrat, I voted for a Libertarian. You know what they all had in common? Every one of them was pro-life. I used to vote straight party till I realized how often I was voting for anti-life politicians in doing so. I started my story by explaining that I had a client explaining that she just didn't understand how someone could be so dumb as to be one-issue voters. I spoke up and I said, I'm a one-issue voter. There's no other issue that compares with the importance. There's one issue by which the criteria says I will or I will not even consider giving you my vote. I mentioned earlier that we need to understand the kind of warfare that we're in, and ultimately we're in a spiritual warfare. Secondly, we're in a warfare of opinions, and we need to be persuasive. But thirdly, we have an impact on this. We can't do it all, but we must do what we can do. The words of these great men, I think, are incredible. The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by bad people, but the silence over that by good people. All that is required for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And to sin by silence when they should protest makes cowards of men. There's no issue in our country that would cost a fraction of the lives of 45 million people over a period of 30 years. Do what you can do. By all means, do. Don't get appalled. I'm not going to show you repulsive abortion photos. That's not what this is. I'll explain it in a moment. This is a precious video or picture. And I'll explain that in a moment. If I have to show you gruesome pictures of what abortion is to persuade you, then we've missed the entire point. This is an amazing set of pictures. On your left, think backwards so I can just look at my own screen. This is 15-year-old Samuel Armas. If I'm not mistaken, he's right around 20 years old today. The picture on the right is 21-week-old bear with me, utero, thank you, picture of Samuel Armas. This was a picture snapped of the spina bifida surgery done in the womb or in utero at 21 weeks. You know what's amazing about this picture? Most of you probably have already caught on to it. Those little fingers grasping a hold of the surgeon's hand. Life is precious. We need to be mindful of that. The humanity of the unborn. These aren't things, I'm going to go back here for just a moment. These aren't things that are being emphasized to our children. These aren't things that we hear a lot about, but these are important issues and important things to be aware of. Just so you don't misunderstand me, I think many forms of birth control are wonderful things. But our medical community as a whole is incredibly flippant about the value of life. I started counseling. I work for a lot of people as young girls come up through the barn, up through the years in the barns I'm working at. And I've had some uncomfortable conversations with them. Ernie, more uncomfortable for them than me. It's hard to make me uncomfortable. But these young girls will be looking at marriage. And I've started telling them, you need to talk to your doctors about birth control. You need to talk to them about the threats. You need to talk to them about the risk because they aren't mentioned well. Amanda had a tubal ligate, tubal. And at the time we had it, I had no idea how common tubal pregnancies are after tubals. You know why I believe we didn't know that? Number one, because we didn't ask, right? That's why I'm mentioning this. Number two, because when we personally had a scare about tubal pregnancy, is Amanda was at home searching, because with horses, we flush the embryos right out of the mares. We FedEx them halfway across the country, put them in a surrogate mare, and there you go. You have it. So Amanda started doing research. You know, the doctors, don't worry about it. It's a simple procedure. Simple procedure. Fortunately for us, it ended up just being a scare. I say this to say how flippant the medical community as a whole is about life. We can't be. We shouldn't be. We won't be. 3 weeks old. A baby has a heartbeat and his or her own blood supply. Separate from the mother's. Oftentimes a different type of the mother's. It's amazing, isn't it? Above amazing. We are establishing the point at 3 weeks old that this is something different than pimple or a lump of cells. Mothers, I'm mindful of the fact that we're online and this will be archived, and most are, I believe, afraid to say it. But mothers, it's not your body. By definition, it's not. By 6 weeks old, that little baby has brain waves and a lot of other things well on its way to being a full human. Boy, see how that terminology just fell into my mouth? Into being fully developed, I mean to say. By 8 weeks, they have every organ. By 11 weeks, that was, remember, 21 weeks when we had that picture of the surgery. Well, it's still up there, grasping his hand. By 11 weeks old, babies are able to grasp a hold of anything that comes in contact with their hands. By 12 weeks old, their nervous system, their nerve endings, and things much too complex for me to understand, let alone articulate, but everything that is needed to feel pain is present at 12 weeks old. I had a debate in college with an individual about this very issue. And I told him, where's the line? Remember, at that time when I was in college in the early 2000s, we were debating partial birth abortion. Which is where the entire baby is born with the exception of its head, his or her head. A sharp instrument is inserted into the back of his or her skull, and his or her brains are sucked out through a tube. Said to this young man I was debating with, where is the line? Is it now a year old? Is it going to be 3 years old? Is it going to be 18? And guess what, brethren? We've come right down that line, haven't we? Because just in the last year, if you'd have told me it, I'd have told you you're exaggerating. But isn't that what we're debating? About born babies? Whether we can take their lives or should be able to take their lives. I'm not going to keep you too long tonight, I assure you, but let's look at some passages here. Science is in the favor. As you turn to Isaiah, the 49th chapter, science is in favor of life. Logic is in favor of the case for life. And God has always been in favor of life. Isaiah 49 and verse 1. Here Isaiah is spoken to. Listen to me, O coastlands, and give attention, you peoples from afar. The Lord called me from the womb, from the body of my mother. He named my name. Isaiah said that God didn't only know my name, but he knew my purpose before I was ever born. Anna, Gabe, Evie, Ella, Jace, Naomi, Debbie. God knew you before you were born. You were precious in his sight then, and you're precious in his sight now. Jeremiah, the first chapter, here Jeremiah makes an incredible statement, very similar to what Isaiah's is. Jeremiah, the first chapter, verses 4 and 5, read as following. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. In Luke, the first chapter, verse 36, they're speaking of John the Baptizer. Luke uses the same word to mean a small boy. Elizabeth conceived a boy. It's exactly what she conceived, a boy. In fact, just a few verses later, we read that that boy recognized the Messiah and leapt within her womb. And just so there's no mistake, by the very next chapter, Luke uses the exact same Greek word to refer to our Messiah laying in the manger. Word meaning young boy. It sure seems strong evidence to me that God does not make the distinctions that we are trying to be told are logical today. America, abortion, and the absurd. It's catchy, but it's sad. We're inconsistent if we take the stance against life. According to our law, as it stands, according to what people are telling us are rational today, children, according to what people in a few years are going to tell you you're crazy if you admit anything else, mamas can murder, but daddies can't. Our law today provides for the prosecution of murder. And by the way, I'm not criticizing this. Exodus gives the same commandments. If someone causes harm to a woman and her child is lost, you can be charged with murder. So the distinction of life, we were just told that the reason abortion is okay is because that baby's not alive. It's not a human. We're inconsistent in our instance. If we take logic to its end, the only logical conclusion, although it be still incredibly illogical, is what makes the difference of life or not is whether the baby's desired or not. If that was the case, all of us that are married would have died long ago. There's been many times in my life that I've not been desired. It's inhumane to kill a dog, but not humans. Michael Vick received 23 months, most of which he served in federal prison. I'm not criticizing that. I'm simply pointing out the inconsistency. That the idea of killing a baby is applauded. Overpopulation is a problem. Don't pollute the planet with babies. This cry started many years ago, and it seeps into a lot of the teaching of our children. We as people are not the problem. Isn't it interesting that this is the very same idea that Herod had? That Pharaoh had. I wonder how many of you thought when I mentioned 45 million babies, what would this country's population be like? Isn't that what we've been heard, emphasized over and over and over and over again? Dad and Gary, is it not true that when you guys were in school, they were telling you that we weren't going to be able to support the Earth's population with food? You're nodding your head. And look at all the fallow land around us. You know why? Because God wasn't done creating in Genesis 1. He's using you as mankind to continue that creation. And we continually improve. We are not pollution. We are productive. And when we act as we should, we don't harm one another. We lift one another up. And we act as though we and our fellow mankind was made in the very image of God. Don't be idle. Do what you can do. Don't be discouraged. Remember the battle is the Lord's. And remember, no matter what judgments come upon a physical nation, you belong to a kingdom that's eternal. One day we're going to live in that beautiful place where there are no wrongs, with 45 million and many more babies that God had given a spirit to. This evening, if you have a spiritual need, if there's a way we can assist you in becoming closer to God, then please make that known by coming forward as together we stand and sing.